And we are live. It's Ed Bailey and Jackie McGuire. Jackie, glad to welcome you here. I'm so glad to have you on the live stream. I work with Jackie every day. Jackie handles a lot of our uh, security programming, security thought leadership, and we're just thrilled to have her here. So, Jackie, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, so I've been at Cribble a little over 6 months now. Feels like a lot longer than that because we've done a lot in the last 6 months. But my background is I was an industry analyst for S&P. So I came from kind of covering companies in the security operations space. And prior to that, I was a data scientist for a SIM vendor. So I wrote a lot of user and entity behavior analytics and anomaly detection. And I'm also a recovered Wall Street financial advisor and a broker in a previous life. So love security though, because it's an ever changing thing. Never a dull moment.
Nice. You got a broad background. I think it's so important to have the diversity of experience to help our prospects, our customers, just help them through their everyday struggles because you've seen it. Almost everyone has struggles in some form or another.
Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting because almost every type of crime has now become cybersecurity, like some type of cyber crime now. So, the financial background and things like that, they all end up kind of helping because a lot of our customers have these challenges that, are business challenges or, operational challenges, but they intersect security in a pretty meaningful way.
Very, very much so. I mean, money drives crime. You don't see a whole lot of crime around something that's free. And so, and that's the thing. We have business and information. Everything is moving online, and so the need now is greater than ever.
For sure.
All right. All right, so we are here today to talk about cyber resilience. I think this is a key topic. This is something that's coming up more and more. I'm glad to see it. I think it's very, very important. And it's just so we're going to give a kind of a high level overview. We're going to talk about kind of go back and forth and talk about the things we each care about because we each have a little bit slightly different perspectives here. So, Jackie, could you start out? Can you tell me? So, what is cyber resilience?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who you talk to. So, we have an official definition of cyber resilience, which is the kind of the ability of an enterprise to limit the impact of incidents and control the business impact that may arise from some type of connectivity issue or system compromise.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. I'm glad that governments, companies are finally extending the idea of uptime and that is our IT systems resilient, but also from a security perspective. So treating a security incident just if a data center or a router has failed. Understand what are we going to do because it's going to happen. So let's talk about how are we going to handle it? How are we going to recover?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. It's starting to make me feel old that I remember a world where the internet wasn't a given. And so much of our business process, everything, there's so many pieces of the modern world that are built with the understanding that internet connectivity is just going to be there. So this like constant connectivity, and I am old enough to remember when I would be online and somebody in my house would pick the phone up and I would get kicked off. So
Right.
it's just really
Mhm.
fascinating to see what's happened in the world and how after, just what a decade of this kind of constant connectivity, we have forgotten that like cyber resilience is so important because it may not be that you have a connection to the internet always and like how many pieces of your business are now contingent on that.
Well said. I vividly remember as a lowly admin about 10 or 15 years ago when our ISP went offline and the whole building had no internet. And so file servers, everything was unavailable, no email. We're just basically standing there, just everyone's just standing there, just looking at each other because it couldn't do anything. It was
Yeah.
just, it really struck home that how much internet access matters.
Yeah. I mean, now we even have our vehicles, right? So we're
That's
getting to a
crazy.
point where we're going to have vehicles that require an internet connection, which is, I don't know, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the topic for another is that Internet of Things use case is, especially from a security perspective, is getting scarier because think about all the devices that are in your car, even in airplanes that are connected to the internet.
Yeah. So to your point, I think now,
Yeah,
we've kind of had a couple incidents in the last few years that have started to make people really question, how what happens to my business if my security vendor gets compromised, if all of our systems are encrypted, if we lose connection to our cloud servers. So it's definitely become more top of mind as we've seen some pretty significant breaches in the last couple years.
definitely. And I think it's good. I mean, this is where I want to put the kind of the emphasis on. I think that point of view has changed. For too long, security was okay. We're gonna stop the breach from happening. We are going to, we're going to worry about the breach, when it happens, instead of saying we're going to assume we're going to get breached, and and have a plan in place for how to handle it. Because I think that change in perspective is finally getting through companies, that you're going to get popped. It's only a matter of how you handle it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, we've started to understand that risk there it's not know your third party risk anymore, right? There's fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth party, and attackers will find a way. And so as this web of connected services and devices has become more and more complex, I think to your point, you can't stop an attack because you if you manage all of your third party risk, that's great, but your third parties may not manage all of their third party risk. And
You're right.
so, yeah, it's an inevitability at this point. So
It
it's
really
more.
is. So, what would you describe some of the elements of cyber resiliency? I mean, I have my point of view in that, but what do you think? Like, what could a company do in order to reinforce or improve their cyber resiliency?
I think like one of the best things that companies can do that I don't necessarily know that they actually do is running through disaster scenarios, right? Like the best way to really test your cyber resiliency is to simulate connectivity loss, security systems loss, and actually uh, understand what would happen in those situations. So, I think the first step is assessing your infrastructure, right? So this sounds like a really basic thing, but security is complex and it evolves over time. And I think more so than IT, what that results in is there's all these like bolt on pieces, right? So when you come into, and I'm sure you've had this, I'm preaching to the choir because you've actually been hands on the keyboard in security longer than I have. But you come into a new organization and very infrequently do they actually have a diagram of this is what our security stack looks like. This is what these different dependencies are. These are what these systems are dependent on. This is, these are the things that are in the cloud and not. And I think developing really good, taking the time and resources to actually do that inventory and understand what pieces of your security infrastructure are in place and why is the first step because you can't really assess any of this unless you actually understand, what your architecture looks like. So I think to your point, if you lose, you can simulate losing an ISP, but I think a lot of our clients have vulnerabilities they don't realize that they have because of the migration to cloud. So starting to get some of that stuff in order, so if you heard like, hey, Google's having a cloud outage, Amazon's having a significant outage, Microsoft's having a significant outage, do you actually know which of your services run on which providers?
Right. And then also, you're probably glad you have an on-prem data center when they're having an outage, but that's a story for a different day. But,
Yeah.
you're completely right. I mean, the tabletop exercises, and that's why, I mean, lots of companies have had the idea of, okay, we're gonna be able to simulate, okay, if the data center goes down, how do we fail over? But extend that infrastructure planning to security is just as important. Like you're mentioning, understanding your security stack, understanding your architecture, understanding your inventory. It's a critical issue I see over and over again where companies simply don't understand what they have, and you cannot respond to an incident if you don't know what you have.
Yeah. And then of course, I mean, at departmental levels, are there plans in place to your point? If you have
Sure.
inventory, is it just if we lose connectivity, nothing goes in or out? Just everything stops? Or is there, a manual system in place? Um, One of the things we talk about a lot too is, and I'm actually in the middle of kind of putting together a use case for this, is kind of like failovers from a data flow perspective.
Mhm.
So we've started to see security companies and service providers experience significant compromise. So one of the things we talk about a lot is decoupling your data sources from their destinations. And what we really mean by that is taking control of the data flow and be the ability to turn it on or off and direct your fire hose wherever you want to. And a lot of infrastructure is highly dependent on a vendor specific agent that's collecting data and sending it somewhere. And so you don't have a lot of options if that vendor gets compromised or you need to redirect that data. So one of the things we've been looking at is, should you have, if you're a cloud-based architecture and you don't have on-premise solution as a failover, should you have some type of data lake or bucket that the full stream of data just goes into if it can't go through your security analytics, just to have a place to store it so that you're not losing that data completely. Things like that I don't think we necessarily think about, because the security tools, they're there for security, right? So I don't know that we necessarily always run the scenario of, okay, but what happens if our security tool is compromised? What happens if, we lose connectivity there because they're cloud-based and their cloud servers are compromised?
And that happens too. We've seen the screenshots of where the person has compromised the EDR console, and
Mhm.
so that's an enormous amount of control. And you have to ask yourself, you think of the tabletop exercises of, if this happens, what do you do?
Yeah. Yeah, and where are your emergency shutoff valves? So
Yep.
that's the I always, I talk about data almost always like water, and
Mm.
that's really the way I think about it, right? Because the questions are always similar, like where's it at? How clean is it? What do we need to do to process it to make it useful for the application we're using it for? Does it need to be potable? Are we drinking it? Could we just use dirty water if we're using it for fire hoses? So when you think about, and I talk about the difference between residential and commercial construction. So in commercial construction, when you have water fixtures, almost every water fixture has a shutoff valve on it. Just because in a commercial situation, if one of your valves blows or a pipe has a leak, you need to be able to isolate that in a very small area so it doesn't disrupt your business operations. And really, we don't take that approach with data. And we take more of a residential approach where we have like maybe one or two shut off valves through the whole house, maybe in the kitchen, maybe outside at the street. And so, really putting in those plans to, if this data source is compromised, we need to be able to just slam it shut. You need to literally within a couple clicks be able to turn it off. And so I think and to to security's credit, right? We're sprinting to try to catch up. Like our ability to generate data has exploded in the last several years. So it's all most of us can do just to make sure we're collecting like 10% of the right stuff, much less the worry about how to turn it on and off and what's going to happen. But the cost of not doing something in this situation is significant.
It's substantial, and that's something I do love about using an observability pipeline. For example, in my last gig, we had our Splunk cluster spread across 2 data centers, with the idea that if we had a failure in one data center, we automatically failed over to the other data center,
Mhm.
to give that ability to be highly resilient. But I think so much of this goes back to, there is a cost, and there's a reason why commercial building is much more expensive than residential, and that's why companies have to have the motivation to make the
Mhm.
proper investments to be resilient. And this is something I appreciate about government regulations. I think cyber insurance is providing an enormous motivation for companies to be more resilient, and also customer audits. That's that third, fourth, fifth party risk as well. So
Yeah.
what do you think's driving? I mean, what's going to drive better cyber resiliency?
Um, Unfortunately, I think this may actually be one place where the federal government is going to actually lead the charge. So I think a lot of regulation is going to cause this. And so what you tend to see is that when the federal government mandates something and then starts to mandate that all of their contractors and vendors who do business with the federal government also adhere to those standards, then it really starts to kind of proliferate through private enterprise. And so this is one area where, I mean, typically I think we think of the government as being kind of archaic and behind the times, but due to the sensitivity of the information the government handles, and again, like even our nuclear arsenal is dependent on data
Mhm.
connections, right? So I
Right.
think I think that's going to be one of the biggest emphasis is regulation. And then I think we're starting to really be able to put dollars and cents to this. So we're going to talk about cyber insurance in a little bit, and that I think has some to do with it, in that we're starting to see insurers say, you know what, we like the losses from insurers who issued cybersecurity insurance and didn't really do due diligence to the customer's infrastructure they were insuring. They really got bit hard in the ass when when ransomware exploded. So insurers are now also going to start, I think, mandating better practices and procedures to get coverage in the first place, and then to have losses actually covered in the event of a situation. And then I think end of the day, it'll be a budget decision. Once we have enough facts and figures of what the cost of not acting is, what the cost of not doing something, that's typically when people will actually, and that's I've always said, like, security has a messaging problem, right? Because, and we talk about this in general, and like, it's very hard to articulate the cost of not doing something, because security works best when it's unseen. Like, that's the preference, is that we just do our jobs and nobody has to see us because everything's secure. But when we can put a dollar amount on, no. So, and that's why I say you need to simulate these things, right? So if you can do this on a Sunday and say, okay, hey, if we lost internet connectivity, this is the downtime for all of these different systems, and the actual impact of business during business hours would be, that gives you a much better foundation for lobbying, for spending money on these things. Because I don't think it's a lack of willingness. I think most security professionals want to spend time and resources on this, but there are a lot more stakeholders when it comes to budgeting.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue is, are you going to fund it? If you see something as unnecessary, if you see your risk profile is not needing it, you're simply just not going to do it. And I understand that from a business perspective, that you may not see as important, but someone else may. And I think that's where the government regulations, especially. Have you seen the EU cyber resilience regulations for banks that are getting ready to be implemented? I think that's going to be pretty dramatic.
Yeah. I have not read them yet, but I've seen the headlines about that. Yeah, and I think, it's gonna cost a lot of money, and to maybe that's a place where we should be doing more from a financial incentive standpoint, right? So, like, the government has been pretty good at incentivizing businesses to do the right thing with tax breaks. So maybe this is an area where some of that money would be really well spent, because the ripple effect of the cost of breaches of a lot of these large companies is a lot more than what giving them tax breaks for spending money on security would be.
Yeah, I think it's definitely necessary, and also I think the SEC is probably going to finalize rulemaking as well about disclosure and transparency. I like the idea of disclosure and transparency as a potential material financial risk, and I think it's just, and I think that's another good place where it doesn't necessarily cost money, but it's going to cause someone to admit something happened. It's going to cause people to be transparent with the market for publicly traded companies, of course. I think that's going to be pretty important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the cyber insurance is another one. Especially, you're going to have the insurance companies are going to come around, and like they're inspecting their home, they're going to inspect your IT infrastructure. And I think this is where frameworks come up. I think you're going to have new cybersecurity frameworks of, are you doing this? Are you backing up your data? Are you using multiple data centers? Think about in cloud. Okay, I've installed in one, I'm set up in one region of a cloud provider, but what if that goes down? What do you do next? I think it's going to drive a lot of best practice discussion about resiliency.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if a lot of people realize how much cyber insurance has actually changed in the last couple years, right? So 3 or 4 years ago, most of these insurers were doing basically, like, had you fill out a form. Like, do you have an antivirus? Do you have an
Yeah,
endpoint? Do you like,
right.
do you have an MSP? So, like, it basically self-reporting what your security posture was. And so they all underwrote insurance, and all of a sudden all these ransomware attacks happen, right? And so insurance companies paid out the nose over ransomware, and losses skyrocketed. And so a couple things have happened. One, insurance has gotten really freaking expensive. So if you can even get it, and a lot of people can't get it. So underwriting standards have gotten really strict. So if you can't document your security processes and procedures, you're probably not getting insurance. And then if you do, A lot of insurers, like Lloyd's of London, who's one of the largest insurers in the world, are dropping coverage for ransomware payments. So, even if you get insurance, it may not actually cover your largest expenses. And then, of course, what we're seeing too is that companies who pay ransom, and a lot of them do because they don't have good cyber resiliency and they can't deal with their systems being inaccessible. You get put on a list of companies that should be attacked again because, and we're also seeing attackers target insurance companies to get their lists of customers because they know that they can afford to pay the ransom because they're insured. So yeah, I think like the insurance industry is having a huge impact on cyber resilience, cyber
Mhm.
risk assessment in general. So that's like attack surface assessment and management is becoming a whole like sub industry of its own because now insurers are pushing this. So I think for in terms of cyber resilience, that's another thing you really need to look at is, does your insurance coverage actually cover what you think it does? Does it cover your ransom payments, but does it also cover the cost of lost revenue from impacted operations? Does it cover the cost of remediation and incident response?
Exactly.
Things like
Across
that.
the
And
board.
then if you're using an MSP,
Yeah.
they need to have insurance as well. And a lot of MSPs don't, which is shocking, but true.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and it's just simply the amount of lost data. I've seen it over and over again. Companies think, "Oh yeah, we're backing the data up," only to find out they're not.
Yeah.
And those are seemingly basic things, but when you're in an understaffed environment, you're focused on customer deliverables. These are things that aren't directly revenue producing, but they are, I think, very, very important. And so I think it helps shape priorities.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of insurance policies also exclude acts of God, which I mean could litigate whether something's an act of God or not.
Right.
But also catastrophic events.
Right.
So then the question becomes, okay, how high a level does the breach have, the disconnect have to occur at for it to be a catastrophic event? So if somebody takes AWS's entire Western regions out, is that a catastrophic event that then falls in the loophole of your insurance policy because it affects enough people that it's excluded?
Well,
I mean, and
sure.
this is the like insurance policies are not written to cover things. They're written to not cover things. Like so
It's just these lawyers are writing them. So yeah,
yeah.
totally. So
Yeah. So,
yeah, it's a good point.
I
Yeah.
really think that companies need to really kind of carefully consider how they're managing financial risk of cyber compromise, any type of security compromise and what's covered and what's not.
Especially, I hope companies are looking at the right type of person to understand this, understanding the intersections of risk and security and insurance,
Yeah.
which is tough to find. Your average security engineer is not going to have these kind of skill sets, and so and that's just another challenge too. Just you have to understand these things and move beyond pushing paper to understand the real set of risk.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used to hold an insurance license and it took class was intense, so to even kind of start to understand how some of this stuff is underwritten and adjudicated. And then, I mean, the other thing too is that if we have a significant event, insurance is not necessarily a given, right? So during the financial crisis, all of the insurers almost went bankrupt. All of the reinsurers almost went
Especially
bankrupt.
the reinsurers. Oh my God.
Yeah, and so I think and I'm writing about this right now. The reinsurance aspect of this, I think the cost of bailing out reinsurers from a catastrophic cyber attack would make the financial crisis look like a drop in the bucket because it would be so widespread and leave no industry untouched if a significant, and I'm talking like somebody manages to cut a bunch of the different fiber links between data centers, something like that, something that takes out a very large
Yeah.
portion of
Six transformers
services.
in Northern California.
Yeah, so I'm writing about that
Yeah.
too, right? Like
That those are the kind of things I think that are not well understood because insurance companies are pricing risk in too. But if
yeah,
you don't understand the scope of the risk and for how many companies that are only operating in one region of a cloud provider and then they're down. It's just
yeah.
it. I mean, and so those are It's big, big picture issues. And so those are, so let's take it down. Let's just at a company level. So what would you recommend? So you got about 10 more minutes. From a company, you're investing in your cyber resiliency. What are the things that you're starting to consider to improve your posture?
Yeah, so I think the first thing would be prioritizing systems and connectivity, right? So, what identifying which are our critical systems, and so if you're dealing with a situation where choices have to be made in terms of what services can be maintained and what not, at least you have somewhere to start. Um, yeah, I mean, I actually should probably put this back on you because you have significantly more experience. Like I'm a data scientist, so I know which things I think are important because I know which things I want fed into the sim so that I can still make detections and do the things I need to
Sure.
do. But
I mean,
um
in my experience, I think the things that start to make sense is, of course, you need your inventory, and that inventory then drives criticality. So it just as you said, these are what's important. I mean, for just to give you a good example with ransomware, I've seen way too many times. Okay, we have 1,000 servers of ransomware. Which ones we do restore first? If you don't know what's on what, you don't know what to restore first. Because ideally, you're restoring production first. But if you don't know what's the difference is, you're going to start on your dev systems or the wrong systems, and you're going to elongate the incident dramatically. So you're absolutely right. I mean, to me, inventory prioritization is critical. Tabletop exercises are critical. Prearrange your requirements in terms of, from a business perspective, this is what matters. Make those decisions before the incident happens. I like to say, act as if it's going to fail, act as if you're going to get breached, and make the decisions beforehand, because in the chaos of the actual incident, you don't want to make those decisions. And
right.
because the faster you have direction, the faster you can start solving the problems. And then process things, like little things, like making sure, like, you have to devote time of making sure once a week your backups are right. And that means taking a sample of your backups and restoring them. It is a small thing that happens over and over again.
Yeah.
Have your backups right. Have a redundancy plan. So for example, if you're going to open up in one region of AWS, make sure you have a mirror in another region of AWS.
Yeah.
Set up your S3 bucket replication so that you have data in your other region. And yes, it costs money, but I think that you have to act as if you're going to have a failure. And then also, I think there's a lot of crossover, operational failure and cyber failure, where these same kind of plans can help solve both of those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Like natural disaster too.
Exactly.
Just all of the contingency planning. And I think there's the interesting phenomena when so I have a good friend who's a firefighter and he was talking he used to be an EMT, now he's a firefighter. And he was
Mhm.
talking about the bystander phenomena, where
Yes.
when something terrible's happening, everybody will literally just stand there and do nothing because nobody wants to make the wrong decision. So
Right.
nobody makes any decision. And if nobody's clearly in charge and there's no priorities and people don't feel like they have any information to make a decision, like they're just not going to do anything. So I think even down to at the end of the day, if like who makes the call, right? Like
Mhm.
who makes the call whether something's shut off or not? And if they're not available, who next makes the call? like
And that's why
um
the tabletop exercises are so critical, and that you have to make these decisions before the incident. Those are the most important decisions. So exactly what you're talking about. Who's in charge? If they're not available, who's in charge? Business criticality. What do we stand up first? What do we fail over? Who's gonna be our third party incident response provider? That we have on contract to bring in. You don't make these decisions after it happens.
yeah. Yeah, and I think, this might go without saying, but if you can make the tabletops fun, that's always good, right? Because like, very few people become SOC analysts to hit dismiss or escalate all day. That's, like,
Yeah.
not it's not why a lot of people go into security. So I think some of these things, if you're doing them right, they actually can really help contribute to your security culture
Oh,
just
exactly.
in general, like morale, like getting to use some of these skills, getting to actually do some of the really cool response that like everybody gets into security to do incident response, but then like the name of the game is not having incidents that you need to respond to, right? So, I think to a certain extent too, like doing some of these things on a somewhat regular basis also makes the job a lot more enjoyable for people.
Well, I think it promotes alignment between security and the business, and I think that's another critical function because too often there's a disconnect there. And
Yeah.
by saying, "Hey, we're going to support your need to promote trust with your customers, be able to provide a service continuously, and especially, and I think you mentioned especially with the weather phenomenons that you really have to invest in resiliency because of just weather alone."
Yeah. Yeah, I think the if the Texas freeze didn't teach us some things, and I happen to be married to somebody who manages a bunch of data centers in Texas, so it was a huge freaking deal, and that can be the pro do you that can be the problem with data sometimes, right? Is that, like, we make a lot of decisions based on data that we have without extremes. So, and yeah, I think that the Dallas Fuse is a really good example of that. It's like, well, it only does this once every hundred and something years.
Right.
Well, if this is that year, probably a big deal. So, yeah,
Yeah. Exactly.
but we've only been living in the modern world for, and the modern world keeps changing. So I think some of this stuff too is just it takes several years between when something first starts to happen, when people can put a price tag on what the problem is, develop ways to address it. So part of this is just we need to keep having these kind of conversations so that people understand that it's not like, hey, you're screwing up. It's like, no, this is an ever evolving and changing thing. And it's kind of a hamster wheel that we're all on.
I've been really following it, especially insurance and reinsurance, because I think there's a real lag there in understanding the risk, the scope of the issues. How do you regulate it? How do you provide it? And I think that's I think something that's going to happen really quickly is that there's going to be a whole new set of standards, and they're instead of having the guy with a clipboard show at your house, there's going to be a security professional showing up and who's going to audit you, and so one more audit that you have to deal with.
Yeah. I actually think that's gonna drive a lot of people to start using MSPs. Like, I think eventually for small and mid-sized businesses, it just won't be feasible to run security
Exactly.
yourself. And
Unfortunately,
I wonder if it won't be, one of the interesting things is we don't really have, like, you don't have to get a license to be a security professional, right? Like, there's certifications people can get, but yeah, I think, there's gonna start to be some more stringent kind of measurements for professionals in security as well, I think.
I've thought that for a long time. Look at professional engineers who are in actual engineering field. You have in liability insurance, you have certifications, you have a whole set of things, and I think that IT engineers are going to move into that realm very quickly. And it's just because what you're doing is as critical as a bridge.
Yeah. No, I
Yep.
100%, and it's kind of in the Wild West for a long time. So, and I don't know that that'll ever change, right? Because, like, the kind of people that are drawn into security are kind of the misfit toys,
Yeah, exactly. And
myself
it's gonna be a
included.
change. Yeah, and I think it's gonna be a change, and that's I mean, you look at a lot of states. I mean, you can't call yourself an engineer unless you've been certified as an engineer by a board.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of things I think are gonna rapidly change. And as IT and IT security matures, I mean, you think about, in the type of engineer that builds a bridge, you have, several hundred years of foundational work behind it. Technology engineers are much, I mean, from a comparison standpoint, relatively immature. And as that profession matures, I think it's going to align very closely to that.
Yeah. And I mean, so what'll happen, right, is there'll be the first kind of really catastrophic incident that happens that causes widespread kind of financial issues and implications. There's going to be a whole host of lawsuits with insurers and reinsurers and suppliers and service providers all pointing fingers at each other. And then I think what'll come of that is a whole bunch of case law that will kind of shape regulation on around some of this. Because I mean, it's what happened after the financial crisis. And I don't necessarily know that things are better after the financial crisis, nor do I know things will be better after that prospective catastrophic event. But I mean, that's the way we usually get somewhere, right? Is that, like, something bad happens, a whole bunch of people sue each other, and then we finally get some type of case law that sits in for regulation while regulators work on it.
My money is the insurance companies start because they have more free reign to make decisions faster than the government and with hopefully more expertise than the government will. But
Yeah.
it's going to get interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time. Do you have any final comments? Do you have anything else you want to share with the audience?
No, I would love your guys' thought and input on topics you'd like to see more of from us. I'm over here steadily writing and producing the content I think is important, but would always love feedback for what you guys would love to see and know more about for the stuff we do, both on the live stream and when I'm out and about talking to people at conferences.
Can you share your social media handle? What's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, I'm honestly Jackie, Jackie, on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find me there.
Awesome. And please, we always want input. We always want feedback. To join the community, cribble.io/community. We have a very large, highly engaged Slack community. We're always looking for feedback. Feedback is truly a gift. So my Twitter handle is ebailey1367. Always like to engage. We're here to help. We're here to help you solve your problems, hopefully solve some pain and make your life better. So thank you very much for everyone's time. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and we'll be back next week. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye.